The Army Painter is coming out with a new product, Masterclass John Blanche, a series of colors curated by the artist John Blanche himself, one of the most important figures in the world of Warhammer. His super interesting surrealist style is kind of what crafted the look of Warhammer 40,000. I've certainly been inspired by his work a lot. In fact, last year I bought this displate. This is the God Emperor atop his golden throne. And I don't know if the story is true, but I saw it on Reddit once. They quoted John Blanche as saying that this depiction of the Emperor, the most famous depiction, is actually a lie. The Emperor's essence is just hidden somewhere in the machine, and this skeletal figure atop a golden throne is actually a facade used to propagandize to the Imperium. And that idea is so grimdark and nasty and so perfectly Warhammer that I really hope it's true. If you look at this painting, you see a lot of red, yellow, black, white, no blues, no greens, not a lot of color, but a lot of the colors that are there, and it all works together to tell a very interesting and unique story. Sometimes this is called the Zorn palette. Artist Anders Zorn was famous for using a limited palette to paint portraits to make them have a really different style and mood to other paintings of the time. I think the colors he used were cadmium red, titanium white, ivory black, and ochre yellow. And using that limited palette gave his paintings a really, really different feel than focusing on different colors to tell that story. And there's a lot of different artists who do something really, really similar. Some artists I really like is Zdzisław Beksiński. He creates these giant, like overpowering monuments and structures using just a few really dominant colors, often red and yellow, to make these really, really elaborate and surreal structures that are frightening to look at. And another artist I really admire is Wayne Barlow, who takes this same sort of style, but in a much more realistic but still surrealist way to create really interesting creatures. He worked on the Harry Potter movies as creature designer and the Avatar films, and has created thousands of illustrations of some of the funkiest creatures you've ever seen. And of course, John Blanche and his original surreal characters are so powerful and captivating that even though they inspired miniatures, which are by definition literal, like a miniature is a hard-edged thing, we still kind of see that it's an interpretation of his original work. And so I'm really excited to give these paints a try and see if I can take a little bit of that magic that is in that color palette and in that original style and put it onto the hard-edge miniature. I want to see what happens. These paint sets come in Volume 1 and Volume 2. I've already taken a peek and prepped these. I have a system for dropper bottles. For opaque colors, I put a drop of paint onto the little flat part of the top so I can see the color easily in my Lazy Susan paint organizer. And for washes and speed paints, I prime the caps white and paint the entire cap. For Volume 1, the Zorn palette exists, although the red is a speed paint red, a transparent red, which will be a little tricky. There's also a dark blue, a dark green, and a dark brown, which is interesting, 2 washes, a black and a red brown, and a reddish gold, which is a very unique collection of colors. To try them out, I'm thinking there's no better test model than a classic Intercessor Space Marine. This is essentially a blank canvas to see what these paints can do. I find it really, really, really interesting that the John Blanche artwork that's so weird and wacky and eccentric, dare I say funky, is the inspiration behind Warhammer 40,000. Because when I take a look at the Space Marine, he's pretty normal, he's pretty literal, he's pretty symmetrical, but there is something there that does harken back to the frenetic energy of those original illustrations. And I wonder if that's why Warhammer 40,000 is so enduring. I'm gonna use these colors and see if I can bring a little bit of the energy from those original illustrations onto a Space Marine. And I'm gonna use Volume 1. There's 2 different sets with 2 different sets of colors, and I'm not sure why. So I'm gonna use Volume 1 for this Space Marine, and I'm gonna give Volume 2 a try a little later. And before I try to paint a Zorn Space Marine, I wanna tell you about today's sponsor. How many nights have you spent staring at the Warhammer store on your boring web browser and felt yourself asking, what if? Well, then the new Opera One R2 browser is here to fix that. There are so many features in this browser, it's hard to pick a favorite. There's the in-browser music and video player, perfect for playing music and video from Spotify or YouTube integrated directly through your browser. There are themes letting you customize your windows to have animated backgrounds, custom colors, sounds, and more. And you can change every little aspect from intensity, modes, and more. If you're the type of person who loves multitasking, you'll love the built-in split screen feature from the Opera One R2 browser, letting you seamlessly view multiple things in browser by simply dragging and dropping. And speaking of tabs, juggling lots of tabs, Opera One R2 makes it easy with tab traces that highlight your last visited tab, making it easy to identify which tab you came from at a glance. And speaking of breezes, the all-new Aria AI is integrated directly into the browser. Have a question? Ask away with whatever screen you're working on using Command/ or Control/ and typing away. With the click of a button, you can move the chat to the sidebar and keep the conversation going. And Aria is great for more than words. Image generation and recognition is baked into the feature, letting you create images with prompts or answering any question you have about a picture. Click on the link in the description to get yourself started with the Opera One R2 browser today. I have to real quick get this fella onto a base, so I'm gonna whip up a classic cork base. I made up a little lip of cork to make this base more dynamic, and I used some 1/8" cork to smooth the top and add a little bit more height. I glued down my marine, dirtying up the edge a little bit, and using some of the scrap to add some more rocks. I sprinkled on some small pebbles and sand and locked it all down with some ultra-thin super glue. One challenge I'm going up against with this mini is how normal he is. Looking at the John Blanche artwork, his characters are very caricature-y. They have exaggerated details and expressions, which is going to be a challenge to work on a mini. I prepared my palette. The dark colors are really interesting. They are so dark and desaturated, I don't think I'll be able to brighten them up and have new colors on the mini. For the most part, I think this yellow and creamy white are going to be my go-tos, and I'm interested to see what these technical paints will do for the mini. I started with a black prime, spraying the mini with this brown color. Then I sprayed him half dark blue and half dark green with the airbrush. This will be my base. Now in terms of painting this marine, I have no idea. I've got some dark colors on there as my shadows, but in terms of painting this sucker, I just gotta go for it because I couldn't possibly do it wrong. So I've just gotta try. I started out mixing my yellow with brown to get an orangey color and started doing some sketchy highlighting. This looked really bright on the mini, but it's still a pretty dark color. I think I want to leave the shadows really dark, like the line work in John Blanche's illustrations. Then I mixed more yellow and started laying on some highlights right on top of the orange. I was being a little bit more sloppy than I usually would be. I want there to be some textury, brushy strokes visible on the mini. I tried mixing white into my dark colors to see if I could get a good shadow color, and they don't brighten very much, mostly just turning into a very gray version of their original color. I found mixing yellow made these colors into a green. Interesting, but I don't know if the mini is ready for these colors just yet. I used the creamy white color to do some bright highlights and then glazed pure yellow over these patches to make some more saturated version of these colors. The yellow is looking good, but I'm not just painting an Imperial Fist, I'm painting a John Blanche Marine. I grabbed the red speed paint and tried throwing this onto the mini and instantly it was working. My shadows are turning bloody and saturated. It's a really interesting look, and I don't think I would have tried it if I had an opaque red instead of a transparent red. After my red shadows, I did a few more layers of light yellow highlights trying to learn these colors. I really like how they're working together. On the trim of the shoulder pad, I used the dark blue to make this into a checker pattern. This feels very Blanchian, as something I haven't seen on Space Marines before. After an edge highlight of creamy yellow, this detail was looking straight out of the illustrations. I focused on his face and right arm and went back and started the process for the rest of the mini, now that I know it works. Seeing more and more of him revealed this way kinda looks like he's stepping into the light, and more of his color and detail is becoming visible. Now I really want some red, and this is gonna be tricky because I don't really have a red, I have a transparent red. I base coated his bolter, armor, left hand, shoulder shield, and left shoulder pad with this creamy white, and then laid down my red contrast. This got me to red, and now I'm feeling like this stuff should be checkerboard. I used the dark blue to sketch in these squares. I messed up a lot, and ended up finding that using the cream and black blue to sketch and then going over these spots at the end with contrast worked best. I mixed the blood red with the dark brown to make my shadow color, and I glazed this, and to highlight the checkers, I mixed red with the cream color to highlight each individual square, doing the same with the dark blue. His left side is looking dapper. I went ahead and finished off the yellow with a few more highlights and shadows. There are still a few colors I haven't used yet. I put some more greens and golds onto the metal of his bolter and the pockets around his waist, and I threw a dark wash over some parts to make the recesses pure black. As an experiment, I put the light brown wash into my airbrush and sprayed this over the mini. It did nothing. But then I tried again with the red through the airbrush and sprayed this from below, and this worked really quickly to turn my shadows into saturated red recesses. He was feeling really close, but there's still not quite enough difference between the dark and the light, so I did some edge highlights using the cream color, doing some dots and lines to add in some more texture. Now that my marine is done, I finished off the base, slobbering on some of the dark colors, and then dry brushing the cream color, and then sloppily using the red to shade. I threw some yellow over the base to make the base look a little bit more consistent with the mini, and then I put down a lot of red. And now, my marine is done. There's something a little Blanchian about this Space Marine. I can be happy with this. I was really surprised to see blue, green, and brown on the palette, but it's a dark blue, green, brown. And so seeing them alongside the overpowering red and yellow, it definitely feels like it just kind of moderates those colors a little bit instead of adding new colors to the palette. It definitely doesn't quite look like the illustrations, but I don't know how possible that really is. If you look at the John Blanche illustration of Jagatai Khan, his giant curvy sword, I don't think is literally meant to represent a sword that has like a 45-degree arc curve, but instead is implying movement with its shape. Similarly, the Primarch Rogel Dorn is not literally made of boxes, but those rectangular shapes to his silhouette like implies his stoicism and strength. Similarly to how Jagatai Khan's illustration is made up of triangles to imply his movement. Those sorts of things that are available in illustration are a lot harder to pull off with a physical miniature, but it might not be impossible. I picked up this Age of Sigmar Mistress Varentai figure forever ago from the used shelf at my friendly local game store, mostly for the cat. This is a great cat, but I think there is something Blanchian about this weird old lady with a Phantom of the Opera mask. With just a little editing, I think it would make a great Inquisitor. The thing I noticed first about this mini is how fragile her little legs sticking out of her big coat look, so I want to emphasize this. I started by giving her a really tall cork tower base. Then I glued her down and snipped off her legs. I drilled holes in her legs and added some pins to her ankles to lengthen her legs. Then I carefully cut away her walking stick musket thing so I can give her a more inquisitorial weapon. I found this Condemnor bolt pistol in the Sisters of Battle kit and pinned it on. Now she's got literal twig legs. I need to bulk them up just a little bit. I've been trying out this Tamiya epoxy putty. It's a little bit easier to work with than green stuff. I wrapped her ankles in this stuff and then used my sculpting tools to smooth them out. I found my ball-shaped tools worked best for pushing the excess putty to the edges where I could carve it off with my hobby knife. Success! She's got some weird legs now. To finish off the base, I glued on some skulls and sprinkled on some sand, locking it down with ultra-thin superglue. Now I have a properly weird mini to try these paints on, and it's good, because Volume 2 is really weird. I'm thinking about how I want to paint my Inquisitor. I gave her hilariously long legs to make her look a little bit more fragile. She's an Inquisitor, so she demands a lot of authority, but she is just a normal human, and so she's pretty wimpy. I'm thinking about how I can paint her up to reinforce those ideas. Also, looking at John Blanche Volume 2, the only light color is this red. There's no white. I didn't know what I'm gonna do without a white paint. I was thinking of zenithaling, but that feels like cheating. These paints were selected for a reason, so I'm just gonna see what happens. To take these colors for a spin, I started out base coating her cloak and socks with a dark red. Now, I could just highlight up to bright red, but I decided to go a different route. I started highlighting with the orangey brown color, doing a bunch of sketchy lines. Then I hit these areas with the red. I feel like the orange helps separate the red from the dark red in a really interesting way. I darkened my red paint and started doing some shading on the red parts. This darkening was tricky to do because I don't have a black paint, I have a black speed paint. Eventually, I switched to pure speed paint and forced in some shadows. And I reinforced the red highlights, doing a few more layers to get the cloak looking crispy. After that, I moved on to her face, and I don't have a beige color or even a tan, so I base coated her face with green and then used the orangey brown to get this color as light as I could to do some highlights. For her pants, I wanted to try out this technical paint. This rusty orange has little particles in it, and I put on many layers of this until there was a fuzziness to her pants and shoes. Then I tried to highlight with the rusty color, which was hard to do because of the texture. On her furry coat, I threw a base coat of the darker green. This stood out nicely from her warm coat and face, and while I was staring at the mini, I wanted to see some color on the base so I could get a better picture. I slobbered the rusty technical paint over the base. This looked really saturated wet, but most of the vibrancy goes away when the paint dries, leaving behind a rusty tinge. I did many coats of this and then tried thinning down some of the orangey brown color and adding flow aid to make a wash. This didn't really work. There was too much texture between the cork, sand, and gritty paint for the color to flow into the recesses. I picked out the skulls with a little bit of highlighting and then used the black contrast paint to shade the bottom half of the base. And while I had this color, I threw it over the fur as well. I came back in with the rusty color, doing some dry brushing on the base, and I called it done. Then I used some greens to highlight the fur, and then a final highlight with the orangey brown. Looking at what's left on the mini, her hair, her glove, I decided to make these the same red as on her cloak. These details have a nice separation from the cloak, so I can make these red and still have a good silhouette. And you know what else has a good silhouette? That's right, our website. EonsOfBattle.com is the place to find our merch, like our new Nick and Jay dice, and the best way to support us doing what we do with a membership. Each month, members will get a credit that they can use on our new monthly terrain pack or any previous pack we have ever made. For the month of January, we made The Fall, Part 2, Guns, Big Guns. This set focuses on printable high-caliber ordnance ready to rock a battlefield. This set features the enormous battle cannon, a building-sized gun encased in a Gothic shrine for sending 100-pound shells into orbit. the sun cannon and energy turret for throwing hot balls of glowing energy across the landscape, and the humble field artillery for mopping up whatever's left. This set perfectly complements the fall buildings and is the second of 3 sets focused on getting a proper 40k board up and running as easily as possible. I put the silver paint over her weapons, armor, and sword, and I used the black wash to shade these. I've got the model in a spot that I'm happy with it using this palette, but man, oh man, is it dark. I feel like if John Blanche painted this figure, he would put it in a black background just to try to get that red, because it's the most saturated color to be the thing that helps this model be a little bit legible. I think I'm not done with this figure. I am gonna steal the yellow from the first set, and I'm gonna keep going. I threw this color onto my palette and instantly it was like a breath of fresh air. I can finally make things bright. I mixed this yellow with my red to make a bright orange and did some highlights on the red parts. Then I did some further highlights using the pure yellow and edge highlights everywhere on the mini, her cloak, her hair, her socks, the fur. I even put this onto the base, highlighting the skulls and dragging a ratty brush of this yellow over the ground to bring a pop of color onto the base. This mini really needed this, and it's yellow. With the colors from set 2, I'm still comfortably in the Zorn palette. Oh yeah, as soon as I got the yellow on the palette, instant game changer. As soon as I got it loaded up on my brush, I'm like, now I can do some serious damage. I really like how this figure turned out. I was not super happy with my sculpting on the legs, but now that it's painted up, it's hard to tell I did any editing to it. It really looks like it's supposed to have stilt-like legs. I am really happy with this weird little Inquisitor. It towers over the Space Marine. That is hilarious. Playing around in the Zorn palette has been a really interesting experiment. Knowing that I was gonna run into those limitations on not being able to have basically any colors to work with, it made me make certain decisions that I definitely wouldn't ordinarily have. Now, in terms of, was this a success in achieving something Blanchian on the miniatures? I don't really know. It's so impossible to take something that is an illustration and then take something that is physical and combine them. I think I got pretty darn close. In terms of these paint sets, John Blanche Masterclass Volume 1 and 2, I think Volume 1 is desperately begging for a red paint and Volume 2 is desperately begging for a yellow paint, so you can really have that classic Zorn palette. I really did have a fun time painting in the John Blanche palette, and now that I've done it for like 10 hours, I just want to paint something blue. I want to do something else. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think of my paint jobs? Did I achieve a John Blanche paint job? I think so. I think I got like 60 or 70% of the way there, and with a little bit more experimentation, maybe I can get something that is a little bit closer to those illustrations. Thanks for watching.